Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Chris. And I want to flag right up front that today's story is a big one because it is the first time we have seen the United States government order a frontier AI lab to pull a deployed model off the market.
That is exactly why we're doing a special second episode today, because this broke late yesterday and it touches questions of national security, export control, and AI safety policy all at once in a way we rarely see.
Let's lay out the basic facts cleanly before we get into the disagreement, because the sequence of events here matters enormously, and a lot of the early coverage has blurred some of the important details together.
Good plan. So yesterday, June 12th, 2026, at 5:21 p.m. Eastern, Anthropic says it received a directive from the U.S. government citing national security authorities under export control law, and the clock started ticking immediately.
Right, and the directive ordered Anthropic to suspend all access to two specific models, Fable 5 and Mythos 5, for any foreign national, whether that person is inside or outside the United States, and even including foreign national Anthropic employees.
Now that scope is the crucial detail that I think a lot of people glossed over, because on paper the order targets foreign nationals, but in practice that is almost impossible to enforce cleanly on a global product.
Exactly, and this is the part that turns a narrow-sounding order into a blunt instrument. Anthropic cannot reliably separate foreign nationals from everyone else in real time across hundreds of millions of users. So the only compliant move is a total shutoff.
So the net effect, even though the language is about foreign nationals, is that Anthropic has had to abruptly disable Fable 5 and Mythos 5 for every single customer worldwide, including all of its American users, just to guarantee compliance.
That is precisely the outcome. And to be clear for listeners, this only hits those two flagship models. Anthropic says access to all of its other models is completely unaffected, so the rest of the lineup keeps running normally.
Okay, so that is the what. Now let's get into the why, because this is where the story gets genuinely murky, and where Anthropic and the government appear to see the same facts very differently from each other.
So according to Anthropic, the letter itself did not spell out the specific national security concern in any detail. Their understanding is that the government believes it became aware of a method of bypassing or jailbreaking Fable 5.
And for anyone who is newer to this language, a jailbreak is just a technique that tricks a model into ignoring its own safety guardrails, getting it to do or say something the safeguards were designed to prevent.
Right, and Anthropic says it actually reviewed a demonstration of this specific technique being used, and what it found was a small number of previously known, relatively minor vulnerabilities rather than some dramatic new capability unlocked by the bypass.
That is a striking claim because Anthropic goes further and says these particular vulnerabilities are simple enough that other publicly available models can discover the very same things without needing any jailbreak or bypass at all.
And that comparison is really the heart of their argument. They point specifically to OpenAI's GPT 5.5, saying the level of capability shown in the report is widely available elsewhere and is used every single day by cybersecurity defenders.
Let's actually unpack what the alleged jailbreak reportedly does, because when I first read National Security Directive, my imagination went to something far more alarming than what Anthropic describes as the actual technical content here.
It really is more mundane than the framing suggests. Anthropic says the only evidence the government has given so far is verbal, and that it essentially consists of asking the model to read a specific code base and then fix any software flaws it finds.
And here's the thing that makes that example so interesting, because reading code and fixing flaws is exactly what defensive security engineers do all day long, and it is one of the most legitimate uses of these coding models.
That is the tension in a nutshell. The same capability that could theoretically help an attacker find a weakness is the capability that helps a defender patch that weakness first, and you genuinely cannot have one without the other.
Let's give the government's side a fair hearing too, though, because there is a coherent worry underneath this, even if the execution is being disputed. And I do not want us to just wave away the national security concern entirely.
That is fair, and the legitimate version of the concern is this. As frontier models get more capable at cybersecurity tasks, regulators worry that a powerful enough model in the wrong hands could meaningfully speed up an attacker, and export control is the existing legal lever they reach for.
And reporting around this suggests the government may have acted after another company claimed it had jailbroken Mythos, which raises its own fascinating questions about how these claims get evaluated and who gets to verify them before a model is pulled.
Which brings us to Anthropic's documented safety posture. because they laid a lot of this out publicly back when they launched Fable 5 and Mythos 5. And that launch context is essential to understanding why they are pushing back so hard now.
So walk us through that posture, because Anthropic is essentially arguing that Fable was not some recklessly released model, but rather one of the most heavily safety-tested systems they have ever shipped to the public.
Right, so they say they instituted safeguards strong enough that many users actually complained the protections were too broad and got in the way, which is a remarkable thing for a company to cite as evidence in its own defense.
It is a clever point, because the usual criticism of a lab is that its safeguards are too weak. And here Anthropic is essentially saying the opposite problem occurred, that customers found Fable overly cautious rather than dangerously permissive.
And on the testing itself, they say that in the weeks before launch, they red team Fable's safeguards for thousands of hours in total, working with the US government, the UKI Safety Institute, multiple private third parties, and internal teams.
That detail about working with the US government before launch is almost painfully ironic, given where we have ended up. Because the same government that helped stress test the safeguards is now the one ordering the model off the market.
It really is, and Anthropic says those tests showed Fable's safeguards are substantially more effective than those of any previously deployed model, and that crucially, no tester has yet found what they call a universal jailbreak.
Define that universal versus non-universal distinction for us carefully, because I think it is doing an enormous amount of the work in this entire dispute, and most listeners have probably never heard the terms drawn apart like this.
Happy to. A non-universal jailbreak is narrow. It might coax out some specific piece of information in a particular circumstance, but it does not break the whole system. A universal jailbreak broadly unlocks a wide range of blocked capabilities at once.
So Anthropic's claim is that what the government is reacting to is, at most, a narrow, non-universal jailbreak, not the catastrophic universal kind, and that nobody, including all those expert red teamers, has actually found a universal break yet.
Exactly. And then they make a deeper and frankly more honest point that I think is worth sitting with, which is that perfect jailbreak resistance probably is not possible today for any model provider anywhere in the industry.
That is a genuinely candid admission, because they are essentially saying every safeguard in the entire industry is vulnerable to some narrow jailbreak, and that universal jailbreaks will likely be discovered eventually no matter how careful any lab is.
And critically, they say they stated all of this clearly and publicly back when they released Fable, so this is not some convenient excuse invented after the fact. It was their openly disclosed expectation about the limits of safety from day one.
So if perfect resistance is impossible, the obvious question is what you actually do about it, and this is where their defense in depth strategy comes in, which I think is the most important concept for people to take away today.
Right, so defense in depth means you do not rely on a single perfect wall. Instead, you aim to make jailbreaks either very narrow or extremely expensive to produce, and then you layer thorough monitoring on top to catch attacks fast.
And that monitoring piece is exactly why Anthropic points to its 30-day data retention requirement for Fable, which is a policy that they openly acknowledge carries real costs for them in terms of customer trust and competitive friction.
It does because plenty of enterprise customers hate mandatory data retention for privacy and compliance reasons. So Anthropic is essentially saying they accepted a commercially painful policy specifically so they could research jailbreaks and shut down any successful attacks quickly.
So they stand by the defense in depth approach and argue it brings Fable's real-world risks down to roughly the level of models already deployed across the industry, which loops right back to that comparison with other available systems.
And they add one more pointed claim, which is that they have not even received a disclosure of a concerning non-universal jailbreak that actually led to a harmful result, just benign responses or minor findings with no Mythos-specific uplift.
Which brings us to the policy disagreement at the center of all this, because Anthropic is in a genuinely delicate position here, complying with a legal order while simultaneously and publicly arguing that the order itself is mistaken.
And I think they navigate that tightrope carefully. They are explicit that they are complying and removing access, but they disagree that finding a narrow potential jailbreak should be grounds for recalling a commercial model used by hundreds of millions of people.
Their warning about precedent is the part that should make every other lab nervous, because Anthropic argues that if this standard were applied across the industry, it would essentially halt all new model deployments for every frontier provider going forward.
And that is not hyperbole when you follow the logic, because if every model has some narrow jailbreak, and a narrow jailbreak is sufficient grounds for a recall, then under that rule, literally no frontier model could ever stay deployed.
They also tie this back to their broader published policy views, arguing that the government absolutely should have the power to block genuinely unsafe deployments, but only through a process that is transparent, fair, clear, and grounded in technical facts.
And their contention is that this particular action simply does not meet those principles. Because the evidence so far has been verbal, the specific concern was not detailed in the letter, and the technical basis appears to be widely available elsewhere.
Let's zoom out because, regardless of who is ultimately right on the technical merits, this feels like a genuine landmark moment in the relationship between the US government and the frontier AI labs that we will be referencing for years.
I completely agree, because up to now, the conversation about government power over AI has been mostly theoretical and forward-looking. And this is the moment it became concrete with a real order pulling a real product overnight.
And the speed is what unsettles me most. Because a directive arriving at 5:21 in the evening and resulting in a global product shutoff the same day shows just how little process stood between a concern and an action here.
Which is exactly why the process questions matter as much as the technical ones. Because even people who strongly support aggressive government oversight of AI should want that oversight to be predictable, evidence-based, and reviewable rather than abrupt and opaque.
Anthropic closes by apologizing to its customers for the disruption, saying it believes this is a misunderstanding, that it is working to restore access as soon as possible, and that it will share more details within the next 24 hours.
So, the honest bottom line for our listeners is that this story is still actively unfolding, and the most important developments, including whatever technical evidence eventually gets disclosed, are probably going to land in the hours and days right after this episode.
That is the perfect place to leave it, with a genuine landmark in AI governance, a sharp disagreement over evidence and process, and a strong reminder that how these decisions get made matters every bit as much as what gets decided. That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.